We say that God is three yet one. There's something about it that seems as if it was just, particularly the way it's often shared or taught to us, as if the church just sort of plucked it from the air and thought, oh, this is a good idea. Let's say God is Trinity. I want to spend a little bit of time this morning trying to explain a bit of how this doctrine emerged, how the church came to confess that God is Trinity. But what I want to focus on most of all, rather than try and explain the doctrine of Trinity, is to say why this doctrine is a good thing, why it's good for us to hold to the doctrine of the Trinity, even if we're pretty unclear at times on what it really means, why this doctrine is still a good thing for us. In the John reading that we just heard a moment ago, we were reminded of that one of those famous verses in John's Gospel that says that in the beginning the Word was with God and the Word was God. John's Gospel wants to tell us straight away that the person of Jesus, God in flesh, who is the one coming into the world, was also there at the beginning of creation. John's Gospel wants to draw for us unity between the revelation of God in Jesus Christ and the Creator God, who was present at the beginning of all things. And by this stage, by the time John's Gospel has been written, there are plenty of people who are members and participants of this church community who would never have physically met the person of Jesus, or probably any one of Jesus' 12 disciples, for instance. Yet the Gospel of John still says that they too have seen the glory of God. In that opening section we just heard, it says that we too have seen God's glory. So it seems that the church is trying to make sense of the way God has revealed God's self. To start with, the Christian church shared from its Jewish heritage this belief that God, the Creator, was there at the beginning of all things. It also has experienced the revelation of the person of Jesus, God in flesh. And it's now experienced the presence of this same God in the life and witness and sharing of community in the church after Jesus' death and resurrection. And so the early church thought that the best way to make sense of this revelation of God in what seems like three phases is to say that God is triune, God is Trinity. We can't just say that God God is three distinct persons. The Christian church couldn't say that there were three gods because it wanted to say that God revealed in the life of Jesus is the same God that was present at creation. It wanted there to be unity between the God that had been revealed to them through Jesus and the God of creation. So this is something about of how the church came to hold to this doctrine of Trinity. That you could think of it as saying, well, as God acts, so God must be. The way God reveals God's self in the world, the way God shows God's self in the world, God must actually be like that. God must be the way God shows God's self. And if God reveals God's self in this Trinitarian form, then Trinity must say something about what God is really like. I don't know whether that makes anything clearer for you. If not, though, bear with me. I want to now try and suggest why this doctrine is still a good thing for us. Why it's a good thing for us to be able to say that the God revealed to us in Jesus Christ and revealed to us through the Spirit present in the life and witness of the church throughout the world is the same God that was present at the moment of creation. One thing that seems to immediately follow from saying that God is Trinity is that God is community. God is the perfect community, we might say. We are not tritheists. We do not say that there are three gods, because that would be to deny the unity between the Creator, God, and the revelation of God in Jesus. But nor are we what the early church called modalists, where we say this is basically just the revelation of God in Jesus, the revelation of the Spirit, is basically just God putting on a different mask or something like that. Because we say that what is revealed to us in Jesus is supposed to show us exactly what God is like. That this is the clearest manifestation and demonstration of what God's nature is really like for us. So if God is community in this fashion, then this says something about the nature of the world that this Trinitarian God has created. At the start, in the story of creation, we're told that human beings are created in the image of God. So if this Creator God is Trinity, is community, then it would seem that human beings have a kind of stamp of community on them. Human beings are creatures made for relationships with each other. Human beings are creatures made to be in fellowship, to be in community with one another. Interestingly, this doctrine of the Trinity in recent times has been taken up and articulated probably most strongly and clearly by several liberation theologians in South America, particularly one fellow named Leonardo Boff, who thinks that this doctrine of the Trinity clearly shows us everything that has gone wrong in our individualist kind of capitalist societies that we see today, where we assume that everyone is basically more or less on their own and in competition with each other. That the doctrine of the Trinity is supposed to stand against every attempt to isolate, every attempt to fragment human community. I think maybe a good example of this, maybe some folk here are old enough to remember Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society, right? That there's just a collection of individuals. If the doctrine of the Trinity is correct, then it's the other way around. There's no such thing as individuals. There's just communities. And so whenever we gather as a community, we are in some way trying to return ourselves to the stamp that's been placed on us. We're trying to return ourselves to what God has actually intended for creation, the formation of community. We can also say, though, that this is an expanding community. It's not a closed or isolated community that God intends. One of the early church fathers, named Origen, tried to describe the way in which the Trinity acts, tried to describe the relationship between the Trinity as it acts, and to use the analogy of a mirror. You know, if you look at yourself in the mirror and you move a hand and you see the hand move back in the mirror. That was what Origen said it's like whenever the Trinity acts. That if one person of the Trinity acts in such a way, then the others act just as identically as our reflection in a mirror. So Origen says this is how close-knit the Trinity of God must be. If that's the case, then if the human community bears this same stamp, then whatever happens to one person in that community is supposed to also move and impact upon other members of that community as well. So wherever there is, even one person, one speck of creation that has been isolated, that has been damaged, that is being cut off, then that demeans or weakens the whole community, the entire community. So there is no conceivable part of creation that does not have a place in this great community that God has created. There is no blade of grass, there is no creature walking anywhere that does not have a place in God's community. It's as if there is this continual expansion of this community where the church is invited to hear the cry of the Spirit saying, you too, this person as well, this creature as well. It's always bigger than you thought. So this is one thing that seems to come out of the doctrine of the Trinity, the importance of community for human beings and for creation, and how this is an expanding community. Here's something else that this same early church writer Origen observed. If God was not Trinity, if God was say, monotheistic in a plainly non-Trinitarian sense, then this God could only ever be admired from a distance. This God would not be someone with whom we could enter into any sense of relationship with. This is not a God who could call us into relationship with God. It's only a God who could be, admired reverently with a gap between us, with a distance between us. But Origen says, clearly, the God that is revealed to us in Jesus is not like this. A Trinitarian God is a God who wants us to be in relationship with God. A Trinitarian God is a God who does not primarily seek admirers. A Trinitarian God is a God who seeks followers, who seeks companions, who seeks friends. Maybe we remember that famous passage in John's Gospel where Jesus addresses his disciples and says, "I have not called you servants, I've called you friends." Origen says, this shows us that God must be Trinitarian, that God must be community in this way, because it's only this kind of God that could call us into this kind of relationship, a God who doesn't just require admiration and reverence from a distance, a God who calls us into relationship. And even more, a God who calls us into participation in God's creating labor. That the Trinitarian God calls us to be co-laborers in God's great plans for all creation. And when you think about this, what better way could there be of undermining every attempt to set creation one part of creation up against another by way of a hierarchy. Because the early church confessed that God as Trinity is not a form of subordination where you have, God the Father as, the supreme king, and then, God the Son as a bit underneath that, and then God the Holy Spirit as a bit underneath that. The early church rightly said that that is heresy, that the Trinity is not, a hierarchy, a sequence of subordination. The Trinity is a community of equality. Whenever the early church gathered for worship, they were instructed never to kneel. Have you ever thought about that? We think of kneeling as one of the most reverent things that we can do in worship. But in the early church, you were forbidden to kneel. Not even in worship to God the Creator. Because this is a God who primarily does not require admirers, but who looks for followers, who wants to be in relationship with you. That God has raised you so that you can look God in the eye as a friend, as a loving friend, as your companion. And so the early church thought, if even to the Lord of all the universe we do not kneel, still less can we ever kneel to any human authority. Still less can we kneel to the Caesars and tyrants of this world who would lord themselves over other people. Still less could we ever permit or practice a kind of hierarchy where one part of the human community sets itself above other parts of the human community and lords itself over them. So this is another thing that comes out of the doctrine of the Trinity, I think. This sense of equality across all creation, the undermining of hierarchies, the undermining of any attempt to subordinate one part of creation beneath another. Here's one last thing I'll mention. Another observation that Origen, this early church father, makes is the way, if God is Trinity, this also says something about the way God acts in the world. That saying I mentioned earlier, as God acts, so also must God be. The converse is also true. As God is, so also must God act. That if God is Trinity, if God is community, then this says something about how God relates to the world. Origen says that we often stumble over talking about the power of God because all we know about in this world in terms of power is the power of political leaders, the power of military leaders, the power of one part of creation to coerce another part of creation. But Origen says if God is Trinity, then whatever God's power looks like, it can't be that. However God acts in the world, it can't be like that. And sometimes I think we do think of God in these ways. We think that the only difference between God and the different sort of tyrants and political leaders that we see in the world is that God just happens to be a more powerful tyrant than they are. Origen says that if we understand God as Trinity, then we can't buy into that. A passage that Origen was especially fond of is the passage that we heard in Proverbs earlier. The idea of God ruling the world through wisdom. That Origen speaks of not so much God forcing the world into being or using overwhelming power to bend the world into God's will, but God ruling the world through wisdom. God's power looks the same as God's love. That if God is love, then in God there can be no violence whatsoever. So any attempt to try and solicit the support of God for the purposes of violence is undermined by the doctrine of the Trinity. Any attempt to try and enlist God as a bringer of vengeance for those on whom we want to see vengeance carried out is undermined by the doctrine of the Trinity. And still more, and this is the very last thing I'll say, even when we think about God as judge over our own lives, God as judge over ourselves, we can't think of God as anything other than a God of love. We can't think of God as judge over our own lives as one who would exercise any kind of vengeance over us. That, friends, when we encounter the Trinitarian God as judge, we see nothing but the face of love. We encounter one who wants nothing but the best for us, and who wants nothing more than to be in relationship with us and see us face to face. So Origen thought, whatever else we say about God's judgment, whatever else we say about how God relates to us, it is entirely as a God of love, who offers us nothing but a complete and wholehearted embrace. So Origen says, if anyone has ever thought of God as someone to fear, as someone to tremble at, as if the first thing that we want to do when we feel God's presence is to flee, to run away. Origen wants us to hear those famous words of Scripture, "Be not afraid," that God looks at you and wants and desires nothing more than to love you and to be in relationship with you. That God does not seek to intimidate you or to bring you into a kind of fearful submission. And friends, what greater gift can there be than this? That if God is not an object of fear, but one who loves us so unconditionally, then what indeed in all creation is there for us to be afraid of? Thanks be to God.